everyone, and welcome to another episode of Because I Have Thoughts. I'm Dr. T, and I just wanted to express my gratitude for everyone who listened to or watched the intro episode and the first episode that was launched 2 weeks ago. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate your support. And thank you for joining me on this interesting ride as we dive into my life experiences and revelations that I've had over the years of learning, teaching, leading, and just exploring life and sharing my lived experience in many different areas of my life. Please like, follow, and subscribe so you can find out whenever new episodes are being dropped. My plan is to drop episodes every 2 weeks, but if you have liked, followed, and subscribed, you'll get a notification that a new episode is being dropped and what that topic is before anybody else. You can easily find both the Spotify link and the YouTube link on my website, which is at drtlcsquared.com/voice. Again, that's drtlcsquared.com/voice. And when you get to that page, there are 2 buttons that you can click. One says listen here, which will take you to Spotify. The other says watch here, and it'll take you to YouTube. If you are listening on Spotify and you want to know my book recommendations, I will list the book recommendations in the title and description of that particular episode. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see the little bubble pop up of the titles that I am talking about with regards to the books. All right, we got a lot of the logistics and formalities out of the way. Let's dive into our topic for the day, which is emotional safety. What is emotional safety? How can we identify it, acquire it, and then provide it for others? So in the last episode, we talked about just because you can doesn't mean you should. Your emotional health can dictate how you can determine the difference between all that you can do and then all that you should do. Just because you have the option or capacity to do something doesn't mean you necessarily should do it, and your emotional health can help you determine whether you should do it or not. So basically, it's about making an emotionally intelligent and emotionally mature decision that brings emotional safety to yourself and to those who have immediate contact or are in relationship with you. All of these components determine your emotional health. All right. I know that was a mouthful, but we're going to walk through it, and I'm going to give you some my own personal experiences with that, and give you some examples of that behavior and what that looks like so you can kind of detect it. Now, these are not all of the answers. These are just some of my lived experiences with regards to emotional health. And I like to keep these videos at or recordings to 20 minutes because I'm a huge fan of Bernie Mac. I love Bernie Mac. He has since passed on, but I still watch some of his old episodes of his sitcoms. Well, one of the principles that I took away, which I know is weird to take a principle away from Bernie Mac, but I did, was that he said to his audience, he was like, you invite me into your homes and into your lives for 20 minutes a day. I want to be a good guest. So it is my attempt to be a good guest by keeping these videos down to 20 minutes. We'll see if we can do it today because this is a very important topic to me, a very rich topic. I actually recorded this video several times because I wanted to make sure that I was being clear and concise with this information because it's very important to me and I want to convey it well. So let's dive in. We've got, according to my clock, we have 16 minutes to get through some very heavy material. So we'll see what happens. So let's start with the American Psychological Association and what they say mental health is in comparison to our emotions. Mental health, they say that mental health is a state of mind characterized by emotional well-being, good behavioral adjustment, relative freedom from anxiety, and freedom from debilitating symptoms. So then they go on to define emotions as a complex reaction pattern involving experiential, behavioral, and psychological elements. Emotions are how individuals deal with matters or situations they find personally significant. So what the APA is stating is that your emotional well-being impacts your mental health. So if you're emotionally healthy, then you can be mentally healthy. To sum up all of that. But considering the APA's explanation with regards to our mental and emotional health, we should be more intentional about our emotional health. Therefore, it'll have a positive impact on our mental health. This is definitely why I wanted to do this episode. I personally have expressed toxic emotional behavior towards people, towards situations, in certain situations. I struggled with anger for a very long time, and that was like my go-to emotion. I didn't have the proper words or techniques or skills to express my emotional state in a healthy manner. So if ever I experience fear, extreme fear, confusion, I felt unloved, unwanted, abandoned, betrayed, deceived, unsafe. Those are just some of the ones that I wrote down, but there's more. But for the sake of time, I'll stick to that list. I just responded in anger. That's the only emotion I knew. I was in a very toxic relationship with anger. I was emotionally ignorant and emotionally immature. I was overly sensitive, easily offended, angered, defensive in my communication, argumentative, and insecure. All of those behaviors were a manifestation of my emotional immaturity and my emotional ignorance because I was emotionally unhealthy. Then through therapy and counseling, some accountability partners in my life, which I will share what that is, but for the sake of time, it's just a person that holds you accountable. You kind of report to them, so to speak, or check in with them. Lots of reading. I gained the tools to acquire emotional intelligence. And I know that's a term that lots of people are talking about nowadays. And I applaud that because we've talked about our health for so long, our physical appearance, that we haven't really had a strong, healthy discussion about emotional health. So I'm really excited that emotional intelligence is being talked about, and that it's a term that has become more common. But in recognizing that I was more comfortable in negative environments instead of healthy environments, I had to do a deep dive, and those were the methods that I took. I am a huge proponent for therapy and for counseling. I think everybody needs it. Even if you think you've had the most perfect life or you've come through so much trauma, you're like, I'm fine. You're not fine. Your emotional unhealthy behaviors someone's being impacted by them. Even if you're inflicting that toxic behavior on yourself, it can be associated with anxiety, depression. You could be overweight. There's so many things that could be evidence that you are emotionally unhealthy and need to gain some emotional intelligence. We sometimes do not have the emotional intelligence because we are held captive by emotional strongholds. For me, I had experienced so much trauma probably in the first 3 decades of my life. My childhood, I experienced physical and emotional abuse. I had physical and emotional violations. Then in my 20s, I suffered several deaths. Deaths can be a trauma that you haven't processed and that has stunted your emotional growth. First, my grandmother passed, and I was really close to my grandmother. She had a huge impact on my life. Then my closest cousin passed very suddenly. She was very young. We hung out a lot. She was probably my closest relative. And then my childhood pastor died. And then my grandfather died, all in my 20s. Well, in the middle of it, I was terribly emotionally unhealthy. Then in my 30s, I took all of that trauma, my childhood trauma, unresolved, all of the deaths that I had experienced, close deaths in my family in my 20s, unresolved. I took all of that into my 30s and then had 9 miscarriages in my 30s and then gave birth to a stillborn. So you take all of that trauma that's unresolved and you do nothing about it. You don't talk about it. You don't mourn the deaths. You don't grieve in a healthy manner. You don't have healthy conversations around all of the trauma you've experienced. That's how you become emotionally unhealthy. And the only way I knew how to express all of that trauma was to be angry all the time. I was angry about everything. Dr. Tony Evans says that many strongholds in life can become emotional strongholds, keeping us hostage, usurping the life that God has intended for us. So gaining emotional intelligence is liberation, it's freedom to move forward towards the hope for your dreams, your passions, and the plans that are for your life. So for me, in finding my emotional intelligence, it gave me the freedom to reunite with my most genuine self, who God truly desired for me to be. I think sometimes that we can be blinded by our trauma, that we can't even see ourselves and how we're impacting other people and how we show up and how people experience us. That emotional intelligence liberates you from that captivity of you of being unhealthy. Soren Kierkegaard, which is a Danish theologist from like the 1800s. Don't ask me why I know that. I just read a lot, y'all. But anyway, he has this great quote that says, life is lived forward, but only understood backward. So you've got to understand your past in order to move forward in your present. And that is the emotional intelligence that liberates you and brings you to emotional maturity. So let's talk through we've talked through emotional intelligence. Now let's talk through emotional maturity. Emotional maturity comes when you now can implement emotional intelligence. It's evidence that you've been liberated from the captivity of your emotions. You are no longer held captive by your trauma and your anger. If anger was your choice, sometimes it can look like someone who's crying at the drop of a hat, like they just cry over everything because their emotions are completely out of control and all they can do is cry. I went through a stage of that actually in my teenage years where I just cried everything made me cry. But that was because I was emotionally unhealthy. I hadn't processed the things that happened to me during my childhood. Create boundaries. You can learn forgiveness, compassion, true forgiveness, because a lot of people, and I don't want to say that I'm policing forgiveness. Everybody's forgiveness looks different. And I really don't like when people police my forgiveness, when they're like, you haven't forgiven me because this, and this, and this. You can't tell me if I've forgiven you or not. Only me and God know if I've forgiven you. So, but emotional maturity gives you true forgiveness where you can interact with that person, you can talk to that person, you can have conversation with them. And it's not like you're unfazed, but you've definitely forgiven them for what they've done, or have forgiveness for the situation that you both were involved in. When you're emotionally mature, you react differently to things that trigger you. So, like I said earlier, there were times where I felt abandoned, unloved, disrespected, and my emotional imbalance, my emotional immaturity caused me to be triggered by that. And then I would just be angry. Well, when you're emotionally mature, you are still triggered. Let me be clear, those triggers will still happen, but you will respond differently. It won't be such a volatile, visceral response to what's happening to you or what's occurring in that moment. You might even consider the other person's own trauma, their own emotional state, and why they would say something or do something that might trigger you. The focus is less about you in that moment and more about the other person. It's like emotional maturity kind of brings in everyone's humanity. In that moment, you realize that you are not the only person who has had trauma and may have not had the possibility or the opportunity to process through that trauma in a healthy manner. That's what emotional maturity is seeing through the eyes of God how gracious you can be and seeing that person as another beloved child of God and loving them in that way. I know personally that my emotional journey has been long, and I'm still processing things. There are still moments where I get triggered and I have to reassess. And how I do that sometimes is I ask myself questions like, what's true in this moment? And what's true is that person that may be triggering me has no idea about the trauma that I've lived through, and they are not purposely trying to trigger that trauma because they're not even aware of it. So asking yourself questions in the moment, that could be audibly or internally, where you're just asking yourself, what's true about the moment that I'm in? Can biologically age and then not emotionally age. We have to be intentional about our emotional health and acquiring emotional intelligence so then we can gain emotional maturity. You know how like people will see a little kid and they'll be like, oh my gosh, they're wise beyond their years. So that's the same thing. You can be wise beyond your years, or you can be unwise within your years. So a person can biologically be 50, but they can emotionally be 16 based on a trauma that happened to them that stunted them at 16. Or sometimes people are stunted by an emotional high that they experienced. Like, that was the best time of my life. So they stay there emotionally and don't move forward because they're afraid that they won't have that emotional high ever again. Either way, our emotions can can stunt us, or we can have intentional methods and behaviors towards gaining emotional intelligence where they can grow us. And as the APA stated, your emotional health governs your mental health. Your body could reflect one age, but your life habits, decisions, and behaviors can reflect another. So once you've acquired emotional intelligence and become emotionally mature, you can begin to identify and acquire and provide emotional safety. So let's recap before we go into emotional safety. We've learned about emotional intelligence, which is acquiring an awareness and processing through and healing from your trauma. And then your emotional maturity is using that emotional intelligence to interact differently with other people in your life and even with your own self. Sometimes our horrible self-talk comes from that emotional trauma that we haven't processed because we're emotionally unhealthy. We're emotionally ignorant. We're emotionally immature. How we can get to emotional safety is by being intentional about gaining emotional intelligence and then growing towards emotional maturity. Then we have the opportunity to provide emotional safety for ourselves and for others. So all of the, I call it get back energy, when people are like very revengeful or pettiness, where they're all about the one-up game, that's evidence of emotional immaturity. That's evidence of emotional ignorance. If you are emotional, intelligent, and secure in you, you don't need to get revenge and get people back. Like, that's not even your job, that's God's job. I'm just saying. So let me give you a present example, because I told you a lot about my past. I wanted to share how I'm still growing in emotional intelligence and emotional maturity, and that it is an ever-going process as we are humans who are constantly learning and changing and evolving. You should always be on a journey towards emotional intelligence and emotional maturity. But recently I don't know, just randomly asked my son, does he feel like he can disagree with me? And he was like, no. And I was like shocked. I was shocked because I feel like I've been working so hard on my emotional intelligence and trying so hard to provide emotional safety for him. But he was like, no. He was like, what you tend to do is become slightly overbearing and intellectualizing everything. He talked about how sometimes he just feels like he's talking to a professor and not his mom. So I have to learn how to take my professor hat off and put my mom hat on so I can be a mom to him in the season of life that he's in, and respectfully provide him an opportunity to convey his emotions and his disagreement in a healthy manner, in a respectful manner, but in an emotionally safe environment. So emotional health is so important. It's necessary to help us grow, mature, learn, and evolve in our lives. And I will say that the pandemic has contributed to a lot of mental health conversations. And I think those conversations need to be governed and include emotional intelligence and emotional maturity. I feel like I've given you a mouthful. We've talked about emotional intelligence. We've talked about emotional maturity, and then providing emotional safety. I'm going to give you some book recommendations because we are beyond the 20-minute mark. So as according to Bernie Mark, I'm being a bad guest in your home and in your life right now, but I'm going to try to wrap up very quickly. Let me find it. So this is like a little pocket book. So if you're not like an avid reader, or you just don't really enjoy reading, which I totally get it. It's not for everybody. Like some people have to really make themselves read. I'm okay with that. I had no judgment here, even though I'm an avid reader. This little pocket book is fantastic for people who just like a quick read. It's called 30 Days to Overcoming Emotional Strongholds by Dr. Tony Evans. This is really good. As you can see, you can see all, if you're looking on YouTube, you can see all of my tabs. I've been through this book several times. I love it. It fits in my purse. It's very helpful if I'm having a really hard day and I'm out and about. I can flip this book open and look at one of my tabs and encourage myself and reinstitute some of the principles that I've gained from this book. So that is 30 Days to Overcoming Emotional Strongholds by Dr. Tony Evans. It didn't start with you. This book takes you through the impact of generational emotional practices or emotional unhealthiness or emotional ignorance or intelligence that you may have gained through your family heritage or your family dynamic and your own family culture. This is a great book to read through to learn about you and how your family dynamic and your generational dynamic influenced your life. Again, it's called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolynn. If you are listening on Spotify, you can find the book list in the description of this episode. If you are viewing on YouTube, you can see the name of the author in the little bubble. I have a lot of books for this episode. I just couldn't decide. So these are my top 4. Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzaro. This book, my son and I actually went through this book together. I've actually taught through this book many times in leadership courses, and I've taught through this book in to my residents when I was in charge of the residency program. This is a good book to check your emotional health. I love this book for leaders because sometimes we are promoted to areas of leadership and our character isn't ready for those promotions. Maybe I'll do an episode about that. So this helps you hone in your character, make sure your character is aligned with the mission of God, your calling for your life. I love this book. If you're not a believer in Christ, please still read this book because we all need emotional intelligence. Again, this is called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzero. Then we have the life wrecker. And I know I introduced that term on the first episode. Some people were like, can I get some context? I mean, like these, when I say it's a life wrecker, these books will wreck your life in the best way. So this book is called The Men We Need by Brant Hansen. My son and I are currently going through this book together. I read it beforehand just to know what was in it, and then now we're going through it together. This book is for men and women. I know it says the men we need, but it's for men and women. Me, as a single mom, I can't teach my son how to be a man because I don't understand being a man. Just like he doesn't understand being a woman, he couldn't teach me how to be a woman. So as a single mom, this book has helped me give my son a barometer on manhood, along with a male mentor. I am not in delusion that my son doesn't need a male mentor. But in conjunction with a male mentor, we are going through this book together. This book has healed me from all male toxicity that I endured in my life, whether it was in relationships, whether it was at a job, whether it was with a pastor or a friend. I think that male toxicity is a part of culture. It is a part of society. And we definitely do not explore the carcasses, the bodies that are left behind from male toxicity. This book is fantastic. Women, if you have experienced some male toxicity, this is a great book to get you in a direction to healing from that, so you can find your emotional intelligence and be emotional mature to gain some great emotional health. And men, this is a great barometer for manhood. But I love this book. This book is The Life Wrecker. I wish it was on grander platforms because it's a great book. I'm actually a fan of Brant Hansen. I've read several of his books. I talk so fast sometimes. But this book is fantastic. All right, we're so over time, guys. I'm so sorry, but this topic was so important to me. I actually didn't get to everything that I wanted to talk about. I still have so many notes. Maybe I'll do a part 2 to this episode and address some of the things that I missed in my notes. But I wish you well on your journey. I hope that you will be intentional towards finding emotional intelligence. I want you to heal so you can have emotional maturity, and then you can provide emotional safety to the people in your lives, as well as an emotional safe space for yourself. Thank you for listening. Again, if you want to find me, you can find me at drtlcsquared.com/voice. Click like, follow, subscribe, and thank you for watching. This is Dr. T for Because I Have Thoughts. Peace.